broadcast. Thank you for joining us tonight. I wanted to share with you my first impression of this book and this author's work. I'd read some synopses of her work and some of her writings before taking this book on as a topic for broadcast. And true to form, true to what I believe based on the synopsis, I don't know that I've ever read an author who I think embodies and speaks such a similar language to the way that I see things and how I approach things. I'll talk a little bit toward the end about how there's a little bit of a difference in a departure, but for the most part, it's another version of what I talk about. So for those of you who enjoy this philosophy, who get a lot out of this philosophy of doing your own work and the impact that your own work has, your own attachment healing, your own family of origin process, the impact that has on your life, and how that then relates to your capacity to be able to be in other relationships, specifically your children. I think this is a fantastic read for you and a fantastic resource. It's a very, very lengthy book, as is the book, The Conscious Parent, but I think because of the way that she talks about it as a practice, as a way of thinking, as a new conceptualization, I think the length of it can be very, very helpful because it approaches this sensibility from many stories, many examples, many principles, many skills, many tools. So with that preamble, let me get right into it. The idea of awakening, of course, is central to her work, to her message. And she talks about when we awaken, we become aware of who we truly are. This awareness brings a realization of how liberating it is to be authentic, to be real, instead of who we think we're supposed to be or who others want us to be. I think a lot of the families that I work with speak about the challenge of raising children in our culture, no matter where you live, with the pressure that you have from the messages from the culture, from the expectations from the culture, and how even when you embark on a departure toward a more healthy, enlightened way of parenting, there's still a lot of pressure. It's a lonely process for you. And so part of what she talks about, she makes a really good point about it, is this idea that to be awakened is to depart from the expected, to depart from the mainstream culture and the pressures that are there around things like image, things like hyper success, this incredible trajectory toward really high functioning, overachieving children. Those are some important distinctions that she makes in her work. Fundamental, like what I talk about consistently, is the idea of knowing oneself in order to be in a healthy relationship with the other. And she makes this very, very clear. In fact, there's a lot of sentences and phrasing in the early part of our book that you could substitute some of the journey of the heroic parent with her book, and you would think that the author was the same. She says the awakened family paves the way for children to own, discover, and express their inner voice. An awakened parent is one who is aware that the traditional paradigms of parenting, where the parent is seen as greater than the child, are obsolete in the modern world, producing dysfunction and disconnection in families. Instead of fixing what they see as the faults in their children, these parents seek to work on themselves, raising their own levels of maturity and presence. I think that middle thought in what I just read and shared is a pretty courageous statement. She talks very clearly about this idea in parenting, this old paradigm where the parent is almost more human than the child. And that sometimes in the way that we look down at our children, we dehumanize them. We talk about them and think about them being less human in incredibly subtle ways. Right? I've given examples where I've yelled at my children, lashed out at them in reaction and frustration, only to take a step back and realize that's an inhumane way to treat somebody. If a friend had treated me that way, if a colleague had treated me that way, there's no way I would tolerate that. But somehow I felt that I had the right to be able to talk to my child that way. And again, she does a pretty good job of explaining how it can be frustrating, it can be triggering, but she also reminds us that it becomes our job to understand our triggers and to be responsible for them. She begins to talk about the idea of ego. and how that's a huge barrier to parenting. I think it's a huge barrier to any kind of relationship. This idea about trying to create a sense in ourselves and project that out into the world that we're okay, that we're good enough. And she also talks about how fear interact with the ego, that if I'm going to be seen as less than, if I'm going to be rejected or unacceptable, if my child's success or failure is a reflection of mine, the pressure that comes along with that can be debilitating. Ego, as she describes it, is an artificial sense of ourselves. It's an idea that we have about ourselves based mostly on other people's opinions. The key to conscious parenting is to become aware of our ego, this persistent voice in our head, and its false ways. Most of the problems we experience in raising children stem from fear, which is a characteristic of the ego. Our fearfulness is extremely detrimental to our children and ultimately the cause of much of the undesirable behavior. I experienced, she says, countless moments in my own parenting when what I truly feel toward my daughter is so easily eclipsed by my ego's reactivity. It is my hope my words can create awareness in parents and not guilt. I want to make a few comments or commentary on the principles that she shares here. This idea, first of all, that fear is such a detrimental force in our parenting. I talk about fear being the enemy. Right? Fear gets in the way. Fear constricts our ability to think rationally, to respond flexibly, to respond with clear intention and clear vision of the other. I love the phrasing that she uses when she talks about that her own fear, her own ego eclipses her daughter and her ability to respond to her daughter's needs. And then this last concept that I just read and shared was, I cannot tell you the years. And I've become better over the years at preparing parents for this, at saying this on the front end so they're not prone to guilt. But as she's concluding one of her sections, she's talking about how parents come to her in this kind of self-reflection, this realization or this judgment that they have failed their children. And she says what I often say, which the goal is about awareness. It needn't come with guilt. But again, because of the way that we were parented, because we were led to believe that when other people had an idea of us, specifically our parents, found us unacceptable, were frustrated or disappointed or in disagreement with us, that we were made to feel bad, and that was somehow our conscience. Somehow that was our moral compass telling us that we had made a mistake and that there was some correction needed. So it's really about when you try to encourage people into awareness, as a therapist, as a parent educator, what you're hoping for is you're hoping to increase awareness and insight, and you're trying to help the parents navigate and avoid the guilt that can often come with a realization that there's a different way of doing it, that some of the ways that you've done it have dented your children. Somebody said that to me recently, assuming that because I have an academic grasp of all of this, that I don't still dent my children, and of course I do. And I say this all the time. If my children need to be perfect, then they're in trouble. But instead, they need me. It's important. It's valuable. It's helpful for me to engage in this practice that the author speaks of. She talks about our children being our awakeners. As we learn to embrace this truth, we stop resisting our children when they act in ways we find challenging, and instead awaken to the fact that this challenge has come into our present because of something in our past that is yet to be resolved. I was sharing with somebody just recently, just this past week, this idea that some people, when they are new to this work, they initially respond to me. They tell me this later, that they at least didn't get what I was talking about. At times were even frustrated with what I had to say, and maybe even angry or found me disagreeable, unlikable. And I joked with this person and I explained that I think it's sometimes It's that moment when I tell them this process that you're going through can really be a gift. This process can be something that later you can look back on and feel grateful for. It can introduce you into a new life, a new way of being that'll improve your life. But it's a strange concept, right? Because people don't experience themselves as fundamentally unhappy until their child begins to, as she says, awaken them. That something else is needed, something else is required in order for this to go well, to go better. She doesn't use very often. She does in a couple of passages use the phrase that I often use, which is to see a child, right? To see them, seeing them is the key. But she talks about it over and over again. She talks about it from a place of mindfulness. Again, he's got a very Eastern philosophy bent to it. In fact, I think one of her other books has a foreword written by the Dalai Lama. So she has a strong connection to Eastern thought. And I think she does something very rare where she blends them well with Western idea and Western thought. But she talks about this idea of finding the child, of resonating with them, of changing our paradigm, which I always talk about from the right and wrong and the good and bad to the wounded and injured and symptomatic. She says children don't need us to lead them to an awakened state because they are already awake. Our task is to foster their natural awareness, providing a context in which it can blossom. To achieve this, parenting needs to shift from controlling our children, which is rooted in our fears and serves to impede their progress, to supporting the development of their physical, emotional, and mental capacities. And that requires a stretching, right? Because our children challenge our ideas, challenge what we thought was okay or normal or acceptable. And of course, by the time that the child ends up at a program like Evoke Therapy programs, the behaviors are incredibly dangerous, right? It's not just the parent's imagination, but they are threatening the child's, at least their quality of life in a significant way, if not literally their life. Since children, she says, develop a solid sense of self when who they are intrinsically is seen and affirmed, it is vital that we connect with each child, not as a clone of ourselves or a fantasy we harbor of who they need to be, but as an individual who is unique. I love the language here. This is a critical piece about being able to see the difference between our projection, trying to go through our own wounded past and heal it in the context of our child, versus being able to see and affirm them. And they can make it hard to see and affirm at times because their decisions can be so irrational. She identifies three core needs that children need. And the first one is the am I seen idea. And the second one is am I worthy? And lastly, do I matter? And really, she talks about these building on each other. I'll say this as clearly and plainly as I can. And it resonates. It really does get affirmed in her work. There is no greater gift that we can give to our children but to see them and to understand them. That even when they're being irrational, even when they're making what we would call poor decisions, that we still have the capacity to empathize, to understand, and to respond to them in a non-judgmental way. Still with our boundaries, our limits, without the energy that eventually becomes their triggers. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. She talks about the unlived life of a parent, the myth of selfless parenting, and this idea that we can fulfill ourselves through our children. And in this way of thinking, if we can fulfill ourselves through our children, it's really then our children feeding us and taking care of us, versus us going on our own journey, taking care of ourselves, healing our wounds, looking at our thoughts, our beliefs, our perceptions, our reactions, our triggers, owning them, so that we have a greater capacity to come back towards our child. You might get from what I'm speaking that this is a very philosophical, at times poetic book. And perhaps that's why it deserves the length that it has. It's quite a long book. because when we learn something so abstract as these kinds of principles, it's important that we have many examples, many explanations, many case studies, the use of many images and metaphors to reinforce something that's hard to grasp. She says, with regard to the unlived life, parents must be in touch with our own rich inner life to fulfill this role successfully, this role as a parent. If not, she goes on to say, we will be needy, which is precisely how, as parents, we so often end up using our children to fulfill our own dreams. So how to become more conscious? I didn't find her to be as clear as I would want her to be in this part. She talked about it. She gave a lot of tools, a lot of skills. I'm going to read to you 7 myths that she gives. I'm going to read to you some exercises, some mantras that she gives. I think that's fantastic. What she doesn't say explicitly is, which I will say, is that it's hard to do this on by yourself with merely a book. That ideally you engage a therapist. Ideally you engage a sponsor, somebody who can challenge you, ask you questions. You've got to be willing to and open to the process for sure. But I think it takes outside help, and she doesn't make that as clear as I would want to make it. She talks about the idea of developing a practice where we notice our triggers, that it's about us, that we don't describe them while pointing at our children and talking about how they are and how they're causing it. We must be committed to curiosity, she says, right? And that's really the motivation that comes into it. We have to be willing to ask questions, to think about things differently, to challenge our ideas, our beliefs, the things that we've taken from the culture. Exploring your beliefs, of course, and then I added in italics, do it with somebody else. Get some help, not just a book, but actually sit in weekly therapy with somebody else. She talks about parental Kool-Aid. Excuse me. That's not this one. She actually does talk about parental Kool-Aid, but that's not the point. She said, my goal as a parent is to raise a child who is firmly rooted in who she is, certain of her inherent worth, and able to express herself with authenticity and be grounded in her relationship. And that takes a fairly grounded parent. So let's go through her 7 myths that she identified. The first one is parenting is about the child. I remember saying, and I shared this a couple of years ago when I was at a party in New York in preparation for the Wilderness Play. Somebody was asking me about my book and about what my philosophy was. And I went so far as to say parenting really isn't about the child. And I corrected myself and backed off of that one step and said, let me say it a little bit differently. The challenges in parenting aren't about the child. The challenges are in us. But she goes a step farther and says it's not about the child. Placing expectations on your child instead of allowing the child's own natural inclinations to emerge spontaneously may well result in an emotional Grand Canyon between you and your child. As the gap widens, a flood of anxiety will rush in to fill it. Anxiety not only for your child, but also for yourself. So expectations prevent connection. Expectations create distance. Expectations are about you instead of seeing your child. Like I said, she challenges the idea of selfless parenting. And she says, I invite parents to dare to raise themselves first and to put yourself under scrutiny. I think if you've listened to my work for any length of time, you know that is absolutely parallel to what I talk about. Here are some of her affirmations or things that she invites people to make a commitment, a new way of thinking. The affirmations of raising oneself. Number 1, I fully accept that parenting is about raising myself, not my child. Number 2, I realize that the onus for change lies solely with me, not my child. Number 3, I'm aware that my struggles are reflections of my inner conflicts. And number 4, I will transform each challenge into a question that asks, what does this say about me? So it's just a mantra, a way of turning everything back into self-reflection. Myth number 2, a successful child is ahead of the curve. I was just talking to somebody that I do parent coaching with just recently, describing they were all adult children, and how some of them that were struggling earlier actually were really preparing themselves for adulthood more effectively. She says pushing a child to succeed early is often entirely ego-driven by the parents, who want both validation of their parenting and a living, breathing trophy of their own success as parents for all to see. When I visit the North Shore in Chicago, when I visit Manhattan, when I visit Palo Alto, California, and it's not limited to those places. Anywhere where there's a metropolitan area where there's competition, Los Angeles, right? Atlanta. There's this idea in the culture that children have to start off early in preschool in a very disciplined way in order to be successful. And she talks about a much more engaged way of parenting, about being curious and teaching children about the love of learning. And that the pressures, the anxieties, there's a lot of articles coming out in popular publications as of late that talk about the anxiety of our children is multiplying. And what she's suggesting is this is coming from our culture, and it's being funneled through us onto our children, that our children need to be successful, early, in order to be successful in life. She talks about potential, and her biggest complaint about the idea of talking about a child's potential is that it doesn't appreciate where the child is at the present moment. There's other research that talks about the idea of discussing a child's potential puts more pressure on them to succeed, causes more anxiety. They avoid difficult tasks. I've shared those with you. The idea of a growth mindset, that one can work and develop over time, and you're not necessarily born with great gifts, but you develop them. One of the things that she talks about, this is a phrase that I'll generalize to a lot of things I hear from parents. It's hard to be the only parent. She shares this story. It's hard to be the only parent who doesn't focus on grades and doesn't push their kid. And that's right. It is hard. It's a challenge. You're going to feel lonely. That is why I believe joining the groups, joining the podcasts, joining Al-Anon, joining other places where you can be around people who see this way of being, who see the trappings of the things that our culture teaches. The affirmation is to create a new kind of curve, a new perspective on our child's growth curve. And she talks about them in terms of dare. I dare, number 1, to redefine success as measured less by achievement and more by spirit. I dare to allow my child to develop an ownership of life, taking their lead on what interests and motivates them. I dare to allow my child to enjoy childhood with as few impositions on their time and space as possible. I dare to expose my child to fun and spontaneous hobbies without turning them into competitive events. I dare to teach my child that the only curve they need to follow is the one that emanates from their own spirit. And I dare to let my child be average. The phrase I dare and all of that really does lend itself to the idea of heroic parenting, right? That if you're going to do this work that we talk about at Evoke, you're going to do something heroic. You're going to do something that takes courage. I don't know of many things that require more courage than the challenge, the scripts, the beliefs, the expectations of our culture and our family of origin. They're wired into us to lead us to have every belief that if we betray those, that we're going to be found to be unacceptable, a failure, and that we won't matter. Myth number 3, there are good children and bad children. When I got to myth number 3, I was elated about it because it's something we've been teaching for 20 years. removing those words from our vocabulary almost completely. She talks about children being measured by their traits, like a colicky baby is considered a bad baby. That a cooperative, docile baby is a good baby. So even in the earliest days of infancy, we began to define children by traits that they have no choice over. And then later on, those are things like attention span, right? Distractibility, learning differences, other personality traits that might be thought of as less desirable than others in our children. Some of which, much of which, have very little control over. But really, what it is, it's those things that encroach upon the needs of others, parents, teachers. Like in a classroom, to have some of the traits that I just described doesn't make it easy to teach. So we send messages of shame so the child can get back in line to the group. And that can happen in our own lives. Children are frustrating. Children are exhausting. Children are difficult. Excuse me. But for us to be effective as parents, it's important that we take care of that energy elsewhere instead of asking them to fit into something so that we're less stressed out. Our insecurity and longing for acceptance in society leads us to think about our children, behaviors in our children, as good and bad. And again, she does a beautiful job about talking about the difference between defiance or defense, right? Is it a symptom or is it just them being rebellious? And can we change our perspective by becoming curious, by de-emphasizing compliance and replacing it with a model that asks questions and listens to the child? What need are they getting met? And again, that requires energy, that requires capacity, that requires patience. And in my book, figuratively speaking, it requires the help of somebody else. Shifting from the paradigm of goodness to authenticity. Instead of obsessing over conformity, perfect behavior, and outward appearances, I will encourage genuineness in my child. Instead of praising compliance, I will praise the courage to be authentic. Instead of demanding obedience, I will encourage self-expression. Instead of defining my child's future based on her performance, I will define it as based on her strength of spirit. Number 4, good parents are naturals. I don't know if I thought this myself, but I definitely thought it was going to be easier than it is. A lot easier than it is. I thought that maybe because I was going to school and studying family science, that was going to make it easy for me, right? I could read a few parenting books. So I don't know if I thought of it as natural, but I definitely thought it was going to be easier. And she just talks about stop the romanticizing and the fantasizing, right? About what parenting is and that it comes easy and natural for people. And that this expectation about what it will be like is a significant cause of dissatisfaction, unhappiness, anxiety, and depression in parents. The learning curve for a parent is long, and the bubble needs bursting. The bubble that we believe in, that we live in, thinking that it's going to be easy, that it's going to be effortless, and that we're either just a failure or a success. That some people seem to be doing it effortlessly, and that we're either incapable of it. It takes all too much energy. She talks about looking at ourselves much more humanly, much more human, somewhere in the middle between good and bad. That we have great traits and we have weaknesses. And then this mantra, making the shift from fantasy to reality. I will make the shift from, number 1, believing I should be a natural at parenting, and instead understand that I will feel like a novice a lot of the time. I'll make the shift from desiring perfection in myself or my child and instead focusing on growth. I will make the shift from wanting parenthood to be easy and predictable and instead accept that it's natural to find it stressful, overwhelming, and exhausting. I will make the shift from pressuring myself to intuitively know it all and instead realize that conscious parenting is a muscle I must build. So again, you can hear that it's a practice, and we have to talk ourselves through it. Myth number 5: a good parent is a loving parent. And basically, what she's saying is that's the starting point. That's the beginning. But that there's so much more, like I talked about, than this feeling of affection, this feeling of warmth that we have for our children. She talks about that we have to raise our capacity, our abilities, our skill set. We have to stretch ourselves and other areas of our character to be a more effective parent, specifically doing battle with our fear. She says it's a myth that if we love our children enough, we'll be able to give them what they need. Just because we love our children doesn't mean we know how to be present with them, attuned to their inner world, and able to help them realize who they are. It certainly doesn't mean that we know how to navigate our own anxiety, control our reactivity, or harness our reason and objectivity so we can be of help to them. She talks about our intention and how it's received, and being sensitive that those aren't necessarily the same thing. I'm going to put an asterisk by this one at the end, but there's some part of this that I really agree with, right? That you might experience some of your, for example, correction of your child as love. Some of your lecturing or nagging. Some of your consequences as love. They don't necessarily experience it as that. And so she asks us to be sensitive and aware of that, to be able to listen, to see where the child is coming from. She says our children have little regard for our intentions, instead tuning into how our interactions make them feel. It's at the feeling level that dysfunction occurs. Only when we tune into our children at their feeling level, not our own, are we able to meet their spirit as it manifests moment by moment. I put a little asterisk by that because many of the parents that I work with are held hostage by how their child perceives things. In other words, if my child says they don't feel loved, then I have to capitulate. If my child says that I'm not being fair or caring or present, choose the adjective, then I have to capitulate and change my response. So I want you to be careful of that one. I think what she's talking about is understanding where they're coming from, and what I'm saying is it doesn't mean you have to change. It just means that you don't react with anger, frustration, and judgment. You respond compassionately and clearly, but don't feel like you have to change your boundary, change your line in the sand. Love for the self is the key. Again, you're hearing me on this broadcast talk about the idea over and over again. This is somebody who gets it consistently, and it's non-intuitive. Love of self is the key to healthy relationships with others, and it's a work for most of us. It doesn't come natural. Love, as I define it, she says, is the ability to fully see, accept, and honor the other person for who they really are. And I put in parentheses, capacity. Right? This is the quote, my favorite quote that I've given to you all many times, that Gandhi said, "The coward is incapable of exhibiting love. It is only the prerogative of the brave. Projection, fusion, and going home are easy. Loving another's otherness is heroic." So it's about developing capacity. And the mantras for myth number 5, moving beyond love into consciousness, are these. I will transform, number 1, the basis of my love from fear to trust. Number 2, I will transform my love from self-absorption to connection. Number 3, I will transform my way of showing my love if it doesn't feel like love to my child. And number 4, I will transform my love from need to consciousness. She's very clear in her writing and her work about the difference between love and needing, that they're not the same thing, and that we get clear on the two, because like I said, many parents mistake the two. Myth number 6, parenting is about raising a happy child. I think probably most parents that are in our process, that are at Evoke or have been to Evoke, get this one clearly. Life is unpredictable. Life is it's not going to give us what we need or expect much of the time. We need to practice radical acceptance. Pain and hurt are inevitable. They're a part of life. And really, because she comes at it from an Eastern mindfulness perspective, This idea that we teach our children that all feelings have their place, that feeling a wide range of emotions, pain, sadness, are okay. They're not something we need to fix. They're something that we move through, that we learn to integrate into ourselves. The point is, she says, is not to judge based on how it makes us feel, but instead to fully explore its rich tapestry of both light and dark moments. It's beautiful. The trappings of trying to have the child fit in, right? Children want to fit in. And sometimes we as parents want nothing more than for them to fit in. And how difficult that can make their life. How that anxiety that we have projected onto them can multiply exponentially their own anxiety and their own desire to hide who they are authentically. A whole lot of doing, she says, may be the hallmark of adulthood, but being is the woman of childhood, right? Being who we are is what she's trying to encourage and to foster. And the mantra for number 6, end the chase for happiness and engage in the as is. She says, I pledge to no longer look for an experience to be other than what it is. Number 2, I pledge to not need an experience to make me happy, but instead to make me grow. Number 3, I pledge to not look to what I didn't receive, but instead to introspect on what I choose to give. Number 4, I pledge to stop interpreting experiences based on the outcome, but instead interpret them based on the process. Right? I mean, how many of this is just like so much of what we talk about, outcomes. And lastly, I pledge to resist judging my life or myself for not being perfect, and instead to embrace the wholeness of the imperfections. Number 7, myth number 7, parents need to be in control. I think this one's, again, probably pretty obvious if you're on this webinar, if you've been on more than 3 webinars. This is probably pretty obvious to you. From the book, yes, you are responsible for how you are around them, I replied, and no, you have no control over them. The art of conscious parenting lies in understanding that our ability to control our children is limited at best, and certainly undermined by our belief that we have any. Our mandate is to be in charge of their safety and well-being, but this has a clear limit. If we aren't aware of this limit, we will make the mistake of believing we are in control of who they intrinsically are. Am I setting up the environment in a manner that promotes harmony or disharmony? Right? What's my contribution? What's my involvement? What's my relationship in our family, like with our child? What am I doing or not doing that leads my children to behave in a particular way? I think that even something as seemingly one-sided as lying, if you have the ego strength, right, to ask the question, what might I be doing that makes it unsafe for my child to approach me? You've made a significant step towards your child if you can ask that question. And that comes for many people with a sense of peril that if I look at my own accountability, for example, in my child lying to me, then I'm not going to hold them accountable. Thus, I'm not going to control their truth telling. So you have to do battle with your fear. Because our children are smaller and younger than us, we unconsciously, and sometimes not so unconsciously, take this to mean that they are less knowing and even less human than we are. This is what I was describing earlier. I doubt any parent would actually say children are less human, and yet we frequently act as if they were by ignoring or overriding their uniqueness. She gives lots of stories of parents deciding what children's passions are, and even when they're infants, that they're going to love baseball or art or various things. She gives one beautiful story of I think it was her, might have been her, approaching a music teacher and saying, I don't care if she becomes a concert cellist. I just want you to focus on helping her learn to love the process of playing an instrument. And the music teacher got tears in her eyes and said, parents don't say that to me usually. The parents that I work with are hoping that their son or daughter becomes the next Yo-Yo Ma. And she guessed that that teacher was getting in touch with her own love of music that she had developed as a child. So it's just those beautiful moments of finding the child and the process in the child instead of outcomes and successes and getting on top of things. Moving from parent to a spiritual guide, the mantras for myth number 7. Instead of seeing a child, I will see a spiritual being. Instead of identifying myself as a parent, I will identify as a partner. Instead of holding my child to my standards, I will help them create their own. Instead of holding them in dependency, I will liberate them to autonomy. Instead of treating them as mine, I will usher them to their own selfhood. And then lastly, she adds she has several in her book. They're almost prose. But again, I think it's a nice way to invite you to a practice in being a different way. And at the end of the chapter on myth number 7, she has these sentences, these prose for us. She says, our sacred task as parents is to redefine aggression against our control as defensiveness, lying as a reaction against our rigidity, anger as a rebellion against our disconnection, defiance as a barrier to our resistance, anxiety as an avoidance of our judgment, distraction as a reflection of our own inner chaos, sadness as a mark of our own unworthiness. When we see our children acting out as an impetus for our own awakening, we absolve them of the burden of having to fix themselves. Instead, we embody the change their behavior triggers in us. In doing so, we become emotionally integrated and we set our children free. I'm going to wind down here as we get toward the 45-minute mark of the broadcast. The book goes on for quite a while, and the last third of the book I didn't take as many notes on because it was just many versions of the same kinds of things that she had already described. But that doesn't mean that I don't think it's helpful. I think it's repetitive, and I think the repetition is because she's inviting us into a practice. She talks about expectations versus engagement, becoming engaged with our children. Here's some more prose. A new commitment on shedding expectations. I shed my expectations and agendas, knowing they stem from my small mind space. Instead, I will enter my expansive heart space and release you from meeting my needs, expecting only that I do this for myself. When I see you, I will no longer reflect my fears, insecurities, longings, and drama. Instead, I will clear the mental cobwebs, that cloud, the shine of your brilliance, so that I can be the mirror of the diamond that you are. As my agendas melt away, so does the hollowness I feel, leaving only wholeness in its place. She talks about in one of her chapters from mindfulness reaction to mindful presence. There's a lot of work that she talks about in terms of our becoming reactive. And the work that I've shared with you in attachment theory, that can be called response flexibility, right? Where we're operating on our frontal lobe in the top portions of our brain instead of the fight or flight lower portions of our brain. She talks about presence. To me, presence connotes the ability to be fully aware of one's present. It requires that we suspend thought, ideas, opinions, and beliefs. We simply are. We have fewer opinions. I've shared many times that it is something I aspire to have no opinion about my children, which some people think to mean as total disengagement or disinterest, but it's this kind of thought, right? Lower my judgment so I can be with them and see them and reflect it back. And that, in my experience, is my most healing contribution. Listening without the ego and the anxiety of the future. She doesn't use the phrase future tripping, but she talks about it a lot. She gives examples of her daughter talking about fashion and a dress, and she's over there worried that her daughter's not going to grow up to be this humanitarian. And her daughter puts her in her place and says, look, I'm 12 years old. 12-year-olds talk about fashion. And maybe I just won't share it with you if you can't handle it. And of course, she goes back and apologizes. So that's a simple example, but we do that with our children. Acceptance of the present moment doesn't mean you are passive or resigned to things. That's what a lot of parents hear me say. It simply means that the sting of the emotional charge is taken out of the situation. Sure, you can correct your child and even assertively create boundaries if they are needed, but the entire exchange is executed without adding in the emotional charge of fear, panic, shame, or guilt. That paragraph, I think, wonderfully encapsulates what I'm always talking about when I say You can set boundaries. It does not require you to compromise your boundaries or your limits. It just doesn't come laden with the emotional coercion, punishment, and scarring of some of these emotions like fear, intimidation, panic, shame, and guilt. She talks about impermanence, right? Another Eastern philosophical idea that everything is evolving, that we have the ability to take a step back and see the longer arc. And then when somebody's struggling, doesn't mean that they're always going to struggle. When somebody's hurting, they're not always going to hurt, so forth and so on. She makes this comment that your reaction is the child's trigger, right? Your reaction is traumatizing to the child when it's in this reactive way that we're describing, that we're trying to move away from. And then she talks about, gives several examples and tools and skills around reaction versus an authentic expression. And to simply put it, and she says it in slightly different language, and so I'd invite you to read that portion. It's basically I messages versus you messages, which of course we talk about and teach from the very beginning. So the pros around mindless reaction to mindful presence, a new commitment to shedding the past. Even though I want to cling to what ought to be and all the ways life should have been, I know that my resistance to what is comes from fear, which blinds me to the jewels of the present moment. If I can let go of my need for control, I can enter the unknown with vigor, flowing with grit, resilience, and power. I can become the agent of the transformation I wish to witness. Resisting nothing, I greet the present moment with awareness and joy. And then she talks about this idea from chaos to silence. And the pros that I'll share with you from that chapter is this. A new commitment from shedding the doing. Detach from the outer world a bit. Let the dishes lie. Let the anger die. Let the chores be undone. It's time to retreat and go within. To enter silence, quiet the din. This is the only way to create a shift. Don't be afraid to enter the self. Beneath the chatter lies a brilliant jewel. Assured, present, resolute, still. The layers need to peel one by one. First the shame, then the unworthiness, then the fear. When you reach the nothingness, you will know that you are near. When you reach your true self, at the deepest core, you will finally know authenticity and freedom. Liberated from fear, you emerge strong and sure, ready to meet the spirit of your child, unencumbered, unfettered, and wild. And then moving into the no role parts of our life. I don't know how applicable this is to some of our parents, because moving into the no role is she talks about it as that time in life when your 18-year-old child is graduating from high school and going off to college. And so many parents have told me, I sent my child away at 14 or 15 or 13 or much younger than was expected. So I think it's unfair to simply share this piece with you. But there is in this some idea about learning to let go of the need to be needed, right? And when we're not needed as much, and even when we turn our child over to therapeutic programs in schools in their mid-teens, early teens, that we have some grief and some loss, and that it still can be okay. There's a grief in letting go in it. She talks about learning from nature, and she uses the metaphor of, in fact, this was amazing to me. She used the metaphor of the earth, the air, the water, and the fire. Those are the 4 stages of our program. Not in that order, but those are the 4 stages of our program, the 4 levels in our program. And very, very similar to the metaphors that she uses to explain them, that we can learn from the earth, from nature, this transformation, this growth, this impermanence, this regeneration that happens. And then she talks about something I talk about all the time, being a container. Probably one of my favorite ideas and concepts. Being a container, she says, for our children's emotions isn't easy and requires us to dip into the sacred space within ourselves, a space that's still and calm. The image of a container is saying to us that when we are non-anxious, we are no longer snared by our own thoughts and emotional reactivity, which allows us to remain neutral in the face of our children's behavior. Instead of blindly reacting, we use humor, storytelling, role-playing, and a host of other relational processes to diffuse our children's acting out. In this way, the container helps our children work through their feelings, allowing them to be increasingly true to who they are. And then she gives examples of the storytelling and the role-playing if you want to expand on that further. But being an adequate container, the idea from attachment theory, that allows our children the safe space to develop who they are. And really the container is this, it's your brain, it's your mind, it's your psyche. So in order to develop as an adequate container, we need to do this work that she invites us into, that we invite you into. The take-homes from this: by shifting the focus away from the child and onto the parent's inner transformation, it holds the potential to awaken families in deep and fundamental ways. Integrating this shift of focus in our daily lives is far from easy for us as parents. It's a practice-based approach. It's not an arrival approach. It's not a step-by-step and you're done. It's a practice and a way of being. A book that you could read more than once. A book that I don't think brings you to the end, but invites you to certain practices to be in a different relationship with your child, which starts with a different relationship with yourself. Of course, it's mindfulness, mindful parenting, being aware of, analyzing, analytical about your own thoughts, feelings, and reactions in the process. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of courage, and it's a journey. We have to remove judgments. All of this helps us to improve our response flexibility, or in her language, our reactiveness. It challenges the messages of our culture, including those of our present culture, and going all the way back to our family of origin and the messages there. It's a way of being with our children rather than It's a way of being with our children rather than imposing our truth upon them. And that's the fundamental idea of the book. So I give it an A. I think there's very few things that are so similar to what we teach and what we try to foster in our parenting. So I'm happy to look at any questions or comments. The author says that our children are already awakened and that we need to allow their inclination to emerge spontaneously, and that parents need to take their lead on what interests and motivates them, liberate them to autonomy. My son was out of Oak because he was floundering due to anxiety and failure to launch. It's a good point. Yeah, I probably didn't do it justice because she's not speaking to you. Okay, she's not speaking to parents whose children are at risk at this level. That's important for me to say. There's application to us because this is how we repair. First of all, let me make one main point. This doesn't preclude you having your child at a book, right? There's so much in her work that if you extrapolate it out, Evoke is a perfectly okay response. Then you have enough space to provide them opportunities, choices, and emotional experience with you and with us that gives them all of this stuff. So you're right. It's not prescriptive at the point where your child is in this much trouble, at this much risk. But we can go back and look at ways of being with our children. And that's what my work is often with parents. Is parents will go back and say, you know, I didn't do that. Or I did some of that, but I did it with an expectation. I did it with a certain idea, an outcome in mind. So you can look back on it. She is speaking to kind of typical children, but there's still wisdom in it that can be a part of the reparative experience that you have at Evoke and after Evoke that you can infuse into your parenting and make application. But I guess that's a good question and a good warning, because if you read it as simply prescriptive, if you do these things right now, everything will go well. It's not that simple. Not that simple at all. How much of each individual child's journey is influenced by the genetics of personality, trend, or type versus emotional and perhaps familial dysfunction and less than perfect parenting? Some kids do indeed seem to struggle more just by their nature. Does that change anything in how we respond? You know, that's a great question. They all come, predetermined in some ways, right? inclined toward certain personalities. Children have colic. Children are difficult to soothe and slow to warm, and on and on and on, even from birth. And the more different than they are from us, the more they require of us, right? The more they ask of us, the more they stretch us. And so some of us have inherently greater challenges than others. I would venture to say that the children and the families that end up in Evoke, not 100%, but more likely, have some of those inherent challenges. I don't spend a lot of time on that because it's something we don't have control over. But it is something that I think lends us all empathy. It can lend us empathy in the process, right? And so the only thing we have control over is our response to a child with ADHD, a child that has Asperger's, a child that has the predisposition toward addiction or depression or anxiety, right? And if that's different than us, it's going to stretch us. And if it's similar to us, it doesn't mean that we have to do less work, because we need to make the separation between us and them. Because if we go about trying to repair our own wounds in our child, we're going to miss them altogether. We can be as handcuffed and handicapped by that as the child that is very different. So great question. It is more challenging, and it is inherent. How does this book help with this profile? So many of our young adults don't know themselves, aren't in touch with what they want out of life and who they are. They are the furthest thing from awakened. Yeah, it helps because, remember, the awakening in this is, she calls the children the awakeners. She does say, like somebody quoted just a moment ago, that children are awake when they're born, when they're children. And she gives several examples of their love for spontaneity, their living in the present moment and being absorbed by it, and so forth and so on. But how it lends itself is to us, to this profile, is to be with your son or daughter as a therapist at Evoke, as a staff member at Evoke, and all the way out to you as a parent, to really be with them in a way that most optimally fosters their development of a self. And that includes those that are stunted or off track, if you want to use that phrase. Requires our awakening, right? Requires me to make this thing, myself, a project in the process. I've got to get some control, accountability over my fear, my anxiety, my frustration, my triggers, my rage, my anger, my expectations, my control, on and on and on. When I'm working on all that and have that at bay, so to speak, I can be more present. I can be a more adequate container in encouraging the young adult that you just described to find themselves. When my stuff is more chaotic and reactive, then I become part of the problem. I become their trigger. I become the impetus for them to lose themselves, to become anxious and afraid, so forth and so on. Could you give some examples of your comment, the comment where I had the asterisk? It resonates with me that our children aren't interested in our intentions, but on how we say this to them emotionally. But as you say, they hold us hostage. How to handle that asterisk? There's a great line, and I won't be able to quote it perfectly, in Parenting from the Inside Out, where Daniel Siegel says something along the lines of, parents can provide for their children an adequate attachment if they have the capacity to listen to their child, to respond to it empathically without feeling the need to fix it. So I think it really depends upon where you are on the continuum. I think when she's talking about the parent that is rigid. She's talking about the parent that is defensive when the child gives feedback. Or you don't love me, and the parent argues and says, this is how I love you, and it escalates, and they get stuck in those patterns. And that is a pattern that I see in parents. And my asterisk is, when a child says, you don't love me, you don't take it at face value as true about you. you see it as them. It's the same idea from the Four Agreements. What they think about you is not about you, but you see it as about them. So it's learning to see other. And what that fosters is empathy, compassion, non-judgment, patience. And you make a decision from that place, from a sensitive, authentic, compassionate, judgmental place. You may decide in your grounded, authentic place that I'm describing to change what you do. And you may not. Regardless, you have all of those characteristics, all of those responses that I just described. So the asterisk is, it's not a knee-jerk reaction where, okay, then I won't, then you can go out on Saturday night now that you're upset, and you see that as me not loving you and not trusting you. But you develop an ability to see and hear them. But you do make the individuated decision from your place. That's what it's about. It seems my kid is far more awakened when speaking with other adults than with me. He seems to be either dumbing down just for my benefit and more self-revelatory with other adults. Is that normal? That's a great comment and a great question. And what I would ask of you is the question, she says this one place in the book, and I talk about this sometimes, is to really go into asking yourself, what is it? Is there something in me that creates a dynamic where I'm less safe for my child? And usually it's based on anxiety and fear. So that's the answer to the question is, and she says it too. She says, go inside of yourself. What is it? What is it in you that's contributing to this dynamic? And most of the time, it's some kind of anxiety and some kind of fear. And your child can sense that. And she makes the comment, you can't fake it. You can't fake authenticity. Thank you for reviewing this book as it was recommended by my child's therapist at her aftercare. I'm in the middle of it and thought there was much, that there was so much aligned with your teaching, especially where I, as a parent and a person, still need to grow. I continue to see this confirmation. Yeah, I think it's a very enlightened approach to parenting and a focus on getting your own individuation as your project so that you can be present with your child. All right. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'll just wrap up with the announcements in the upcoming webinar announcement. We want all parents to go to 6 12-step support group meetings, specifically Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous, any conglomeration of the 6. You can also go to NAMI.org. Your local chapter will have free resources, readings, and classes. You can listen to all of these broadcasts via the podcast on the iPhone or iOS device. Go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Evoke Therapy. You can search us on Facebook. Find us on Facebook by searching Evoke Therapy Programs. You can find the Alumni Foundation on Facebook also. It'll be changing its name soon, and they're looking for more volunteers for the board. So look at the more recent blog by Stephanie Lewis on our blog page if you want to learn more about that. Of course, you can go to our blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. Also, audio versions are available. The workshops, the next workshop, if you can, we would like all parents to go to one of the workshops. January 20th and 21st is the next one up in Oregon. Contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information. The February workshop will be at Entrada. The next intensive, we have a couple of spots left still, January 11th to 14th. If you want to do this, what we talked about tonight, what I talked about tonight, what she talks about in her book, that's what Finding You is about. It's about looking at your past, your trauma, your beliefs. If you want to do this work and you want the help, Finding You is a fantastic way to do it. January 11th through 14th. We also have private family intensives. You can learn more about our intensives by going to by emailing intensives@evoketherapy.com or going to our website. I'll be in the Bay Area next week, January 10th. Special meeting in connection with Palo Alto Preparatory School, 6:30 to 8 p.m. meeting. We're talking about boundaries and what gets in the way in our life. And then I'll be in New York City later in the month on Monday, January 22nd, 7 to 9 p.m. at the City University of New York. in Midtown. Email Andrea@evoketherapy.com for more information. Our pursuit trips are for families or young adults, sober fun, therapy light. I'm going to be talking this Thursday night, January 4th, at 7 p.m. Going to be talking about visits to the field. So thank you for joining us at Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. We hope this is beneficial. Thank you for your interest, your passion, your curiosity, your willingness to open yourself up. I hope these points of contact are helpful for you. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.